So when I was in college, we had, in the house we lived in, we had a steward, and I'd never heard the word before. And it took me a long time to really understand what that meant. And really, I mean, when you live in a community and you have a family and you have friends, and stewardship, I mean, it's taking care of your stuff, or taking care of your friends, or taking care of your family. Maybe you're involved in a church. It's being a part of that, and historic preservation is a lot about stewardship. It's about honoring and respecting the past and taking care of what you have and the things that are important.
I think Old West End, it's just suffering from years and years and years and years of neglect. At one point in time, probably up until the 60s, the neighborhood was vibrant. There were people that were living there and coming into the downtown area, which at that time was still a vibrant place to do business. And then, as what happened in a lot of cities and towns the size of Muncie, the mall was built. McGalliard became, a giant strip mall. So people were directed out towards McGalliard, towards building on the north side of town. And, moving out of those neighborhoods, they left those houses behind to become rentals. And, 50 or 60 or 70 years of being a rental, a lot of times will lead to neglect. And I think that's really the biggest issue in the Old West End, is that you have so many houses that have had neglectful landlords for decades, and it's going to take a lot of money to get those properties back up to a standard that is really going to draw attention to the neighborhood in a good way.
Old West End has really been suffering through Muncie's loss of population and the economic downturn and everything. We've really had to condemn quite a number of houses in Old West End, and it's really a sad situation. We've got just a lot of abandoned and blighted homes.
During the late 90s and the early 2000s, the neighborhood wasn't one of the ones people were moving into. People were moving out of, and the owner occupancy rate went down and the renter occupancy rate went up.
Most of the properties were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, at a time when a lot of the buildings downtown were built in the 1880s, 1890s. So people who are building the businesses are then building the homes. Actually, the Ball stores are really strong. They're going really strong at that time. The gas boom was sometime during that period. So people are moving here in droves.
I think Old West End still benefited greatly from the gas boom and still saw a lot of fairly wealthy people building homes there, merchants and others who are sort of maybe secondary or indirect beneficiaries of Muncie's heyday and the gas boom days.
There's plenty of work, there's plenty of money, and they're working downtown, they're eating downtown, they're buying things downtown, they're shopping downtown, and they're living in the neighborhoods closest to the downtown. So, you have these great big beautiful homes that are inhabited by, people who work for the Ball family, for people who work for the Steel and Wire Company, all of these old manufacturing employers that are in town. In those great big houses, you also have the people who are the doctors and the lawyers and the people who are providing services for those companies as well.
I think the diversity historically in Muncie's neighborhoods is a bit unique. They were very mixed, and so the business owners often lived in very close proximity to where their workers are. It's a characteristic of both the East Central and Old West End neighborhoods that you have very large mansions, and quite close by you may have smaller worker cottages.
A lot of the people that maybe had the money to build a big house, they started out on the east side and then it sort of transitioned over to the west side. And that seems to be the way that the city started to decline. It started in the east side and then declined to the west side. And we've had a lot of revival over on the east side, a lot of interest in reviving those homes. And so that energy, it seems, is starting to filter over to the west side too. So it's like the cycle that's going through.
The whole question of dealing with blighted properties when they're historic is such a struggle. These empty, abandoned buildings attract all sorts of crime: drug dealers, crack houses, arson.
And people still see it that way, even though it's not necessarily the same type of crime or as proliferated, but people still see it that way. So we've got to change that perception. And doing so means we've got to change the way some of the ground is used.
Through the Muncie Action Plan, the Old West End Neighborhood Association has been revitalized and become active. I was at their meeting last night, and there were between 30 and 40 people at a neighborhood association meeting, and that's absolutely fabulous. That's where the revitalization of our neighborhoods really has to start. It's grassroots. It's the neighbors getting together and saying, we need to make things better.
The building is it's over 100 years old, like almost 125 years old. And you know, when I'm tearing all this stuff back, you see like the 80s come down, and you see the 60s come down, and you see the 50s come down, and you really get back to where it's the bones of the structure, and you start to realize that it's bigger than you.
I started at Ball State in my undergraduate degree in history over 10 years ago. I've been here longer than I've been anywhere else in the United States. I'm originally from California. I moved to Indiana, and I moved to Muncie. So I've really felt that Muncie is my home, and I've met a lot of people here who are really invested in the community, and I think that it's one that is really growing. Basically what I do at the moment is facilitate all of the grant funding through NSP3, which is a short acronym that we've given to that grant, and it deals specifically with West Main Street. Unsafe buildings it's an entire process. The building has to be tagged by the building commissioner's office first as being unsafe, and that means that it's vacant, it shows sign of distress, and you can usually tell when something's vacant, especially in the summer because there will be weeds and grass growing up everywhere. Once that paper comes back to our office, the administrator of the Unsafe Building Hearing Authority then sets it for hearing. You cannot leave a property in just a static state in Muncie. If it's vacant, it needs to be occupied because vacancy leads to blight. It leads to people getting into the property, and we've had a lot of fires because of vacancy. It also decreases the property values of the properties nearby. So the property owner has to step up. They have to say what they're going to do with the property. If they don't demolish it, they don't rehabilitate it, it goes into kind of a waiting process. At the moment, we have over 90 properties that are ready for demolition. Unfortunately, we only have funding to tear down about 10 of those. We try and assess which properties need to be torn down first, and we work backwards from that. NSP3 started in, would have been late 2010. Between August and now, August of 2011 and October of 2012, we have signed contracts with 4 developers to rehabilitate 4 different properties. So we are spending a large chunk of that money to rehabilitate 5 rental units at 703 West Main Street. And that's in a building that was built in 1898. So it's a beautiful historic building. And it was originally turned into rentals in the 1970s. So it's been rentals for a while, and they did a good job, but obviously it's been, 30 years, so it needed to be rehabbed again. And then we moved down the street to 615 West Main Street, which was a vacant and abandoned property that went through the Unsafe Building Hearing Authority, was torn down earlier this year, and the lot was purchased by Habitat for Humanity, and this is going to be their first new build in a historic district. So they're doing some really cool things with changing their design so that it mimics the historic properties around it, because you don't want to go into the neighborhood and say, oh, that's a Habitat house, because they all kind of have the same look with a lower pitched roof. And the Historic Preservation Officer, Bill, has been working with the architect to develop the design so that it has a steeper roof that mimics the houses across the street, so that the setback matches the houses next to it, so it's not pushed back so far off the street like you would with modern design. That property, they're looking for home buyers. And the way Habitat works, they like to have the home buyer in place before they build the house, because that way that person can put in their sweat equity hours on the house they're going to live in. They're having a little bit of difficulty, I think, one, because a lot of people aren't in a position to buy a house right now. Also, where that house is located, there are 2 abandoned houses still next door. And we are working to get through with the historic demolition process so that we can possibly take 1 or more of those down. And if that's the case, then there may be potential for rebuilding another Habitat house in the future, and then maybe splitting the lot so that both of those lots have a larger side yard, which is something that a lot of people look for nowadays, especially somebody moving into a 3-bedroom house. They're probably going to have kids, and they'd like to have, you know, a little bit more yard for them to play in, so they would have a safe place to play. Farther down the block is 511 West Main Street, which is the Eco Rehab House. Eco Rehab is a 501c3 nonprofit that started about 4 years ago, 2008. It was formed by an architecture professor at Ball State, Jonathan Spodak. The goal of Eco Rehab is to sustainably rehabilitate properties for resale to low-income residents. I'm sure everyone's heard the quote that the greenest building has already been built. What we want to do is to take these properties in what are traditionally low-income neighborhoods that, you know, are vacant, are abandoned, in need of being rehabilitated, and do it to the greenest standard that we can. Currently, we're working on a project on West Main Street, and that house was built in 1900. It looks pretty rough from the outside, but when you get inside, it's beautiful. It retained all of the original hardwood floors, and all of the molding, all of the trim work is unpainted, undamaged. It still looks great after 112 years. That one we're doing a little bit differently. We are using the students for design purposes, but they're not doing the actual work because of the way that the time worked out with the semester. So we're using a contractor to do that rehabilitation work. That will be a property that is going to be rehabilitated and then resold to a income qualified buyer. I think what HUD is trying to do is they're trying to get people, they understand there's difficulty in getting loans, so they are allowing people who make a little bit more money to buy these properties in the hopes that they can get a loan and then move into the property and be able to keep it. That they're not going to lose it in foreclosure, and that they'll be able to stabilize the neighborhood. It's good to get kids out into the neighborhoods because a lot of times they spend all their time on campus or on the Galliard or on their way out of town. So for them to actually be in the East Central neighborhood or be in Old West End, it's really good for them. I think it helps build like a stronger relationship with Muncie. So maybe when they're done with their degrees, they'll have an interest in staying. It's really our goal to work with property owners to rehabilitate because we want to keep the properties standing, we want to keep them on the tax rolls, we want to keep them inhabited. It's better to have houses in a neighborhood, that's what makes up a neighborhood, or the houses and the people that live inside of them, than to have empty lots. There are a lot of things that are changing and happening in Muncie that are really cool to see, like even just recently the bike lanes. Being here from the beginning of the market at Minnetrista, the farmers market, I mean, to see that grow. Muncie Delaware Clean and Beautiful has a new director, and he's doing a lot of really great things, and there's a lot of energy there. So all these things are really coming together to really help build the community, and I just want to be a part of that.
My name is Brad King, and I'm the president of the Old West End Neighborhood Association here. And basically what that is, I organize the neighborhood association for the benefit of the entire neighborhood, those who are members and those who aren't, and whatever aspect that can be when it comes to improving our quality of living here in the neighborhood. I went to Ball State for anthropology. Once I graduated, I had a job doing cultural resources management at Ball State. And then I left there and got a job at a private company that was still stationed here in Muncie. And my wife had been working at her employment for about a decade. So it just made sense for us to, instead of up and moving and trying to get new jobs or trying to find somewhere else, to stay. But we also like Muncie. There's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of good stuff here. It's kind of a hidden gem when it comes to towns in the Midwest. When we moved here, We were telling people we're going to buy a house over on Mound Street in the Old West End. And people were like, you don't want to move there. There's drugs and prostitute and crime. We're like, we've been over there. It doesn't look that bad. And when we moved over there were some problem areas down the street. Not every house, just every so often you could tell there was some problem areas. When I would go out in the neighborhood, walk my dog, or do yard work, I just made sure that I was noticeable and that people knew that I saw them. And I noticed that those problem areas left. There were renters that either left or the property management decided they were going to change the way it was run, and those areas are no longer problem areas. And so it gets pushed. It always gets pushed to outside. It doesn't go into the core of the neighborhood. It starts going to the outside. And then when more people get involved and they let them know we're not going to stand for drugs or prostitution or fights and crime, then they know to take it somewhere else. Because crime can only survive in areas where you allow it to survive, where you say, I'm too scared to call the police, or I'm too scared to just look at you when you're walking down the street. I think that's what the positive effect is of everyone getting involved and everyone showing that they are going to be involved. We had been doing this as part of the Muncie Action Plan, being the association, as part of the Muncie Action Plan. There was an Old West End association that just wasn't physically active, and it still existed on paper. It never ceased. And then the people, well, I like to call it kind of like the fellowship, the people that are really doing the action, were kind of outside of that. I rewrote the bylaws and committees. And one of them was a resident advocacy committee. That was the idea that we have a pretty high rental occupant rate. So sometimes you might have something that's wrong with your rental and you can't get the landlord to work fast enough or at all, and you don't feel like there's any other source for you to go to, or you feel scared that the landlord will come back at you. This committee is someone that stand next to you, be the support and help you find the outlets you need to get that thing done. The same thing with crime. Maybe you witness a crime. Maybe you are a victim of a crime. Sometimes you don't feel, confident in calling the police and making sure that that crime gets reported. It also will be charged with identifying problem areas. Maybe those areas are places we've seen in the paper. There was a crime, there was whatever's happened, and let everyone know about that. Maybe it's areas that they've got reported to by other neighbors. Well, we've got suspicious activity on the street at this place, and keep that kind of list so everyone knows what's going on and the kind of activities that are going on. Muncie's done corridor restoration before along Walnut Street with the facade program they started, I want to say 10 years ago. But outside of downtown, they do what I like to call, or what's normally called checkerboard. You do a property or two here, you go over here, blocks away, you do another one, and over the course of 20 years, you're back in the same areas doing it again. And I think a way to get that interested is when you have hubs of business or interest hubs that are outside of another hub. Like you have downtown and you have maybe campus. And in between there, it could be a corridor. But you might also have a small grocery store or convenience store or several different commercial stores outside, let's say at the end of Adams Street here, where that would drive money from downtown towards that area to create corridor type restoration. And I think that creates a larger impact in not just historic preservation, not just community development, but in neighborhood restoration. And really neighborhood restoration is what Old West End needs. And I'm an advocate of historic preservation, but I think that's just one facet of redeveloping your neighborhood. And I think that's part of it, is doing this corridor beautification and development. It's obviously a more economically depressed area, but at the same time, we have people that are young professionals that live in areas like Rector Suite apartments, or they've bought houses and live in some of these houses that are historic on Charles Street, Jackson Street, you name it. We have elderly folks that are retired. They might even need house care. To young folks that are college students or renting, and to graduate students who are living in other rentals or even looking to move away from the campus area towards downtown, because as downtown develops, people want to live near that area. It's really a mix match, and I think that historically, that's how the Old West End has been. When you go and look through some of the architecture, you see houses like the one we're in, owned by a prominent family, the Kitzelmans. It's a giant Victorian, Queen Anne. Obviously, this was a prominent structure, a prominent family. When you go towards Power Street, First Street, Second Street, you see not as prominent houses. You see kind of more what might have been working class families at the turn of the century type houses into the 20s. And so those areas, and it's not just like Adams Street's all prominent and First Street's all working class. Those are just good examples. You get that mix match throughout the neighborhood. And I think that really that still survives today. I think that if you look at the Old West End, for example, or really all of Muncie as a pond or a pool of water, right? And you look at the efforts you try to redevelop any area in the Old West End, whether it be through just community development or historic preservation or neighborhood preservation, that's the rock. And so the smaller rock makes a smaller ripple, right? But the larger the rock gets, the bigger the ripple gets, and the farther it travels in that pool of water. And that's the kind of effort you want that are significant, that are going to be long lasting, and that are going to be widespread.
My name is Hans Heinzelman. I do hardwood flooring. And I think of myself as an entrepreneur. That really has stuck with me because I'm an artisan, a craftsman. I'm a woodworker, first and foremost. My passion is the woodworking. I actually graduated from Wabash College with a degree in art and religion. And then I studied with a Finnish carpenter and did sort of an apprenticeship. And then I went and took a look around Europe. I studied art and religion, so really, when I went to Europe, I was backpacking around and some of the museums are more expensive. So, to get in, it could be, on a backpacking budget, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. So what I found myself doing was going into cathedrals and basilicas. And I was amazed at a lot of the artwork that I had studied. It's just, you walk in and you're like, oh my gosh, it's right there on the wall, it's just right there. And you go around the block and you go into another basilica and the great masters they're there and they're represented. I definitely have a real affinity for the old architecture and a respect for craftsmen and artisans. I really, really have come to appreciate these buildings, like how well they're built, and knowing that the people that built them had no power tools. We take it as such a luxury to go over to the miter saw and just cut through a 12-inch board. It's just not a big deal. And then and you think about trim and all its ornateness from 100 years ago on these buildings. And stuff's hand carved. I have a lot of appreciation for that and want to try to retain as much of that as possible, restore as much of that as possible. When I came back here to Muncie, I bought a large space to serve as my art studio. That was really my motivation. And being recognized for restoring 107 has been very, very flattering, but it was nothing I ever set out to do. A lot of the decisions I made were just really what I thought was the right thing to do. When I went to get financed for my building at 107, the bankers were like, "What? You fix that old building up?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Hold on a second." And he ran next door and he got his banker buddy, and they came back in the room and they shut the door and they were like, "Man, if we bought a house, could you fix it up?" And I was like, well, "Yeah, man, am I in trouble?" So we started flipping houses, fixing them up, selling them, and really just did everything from the foundation to the roof. Then was able to buy my neighbor out, and so obtained a couple more buildings. This building we're in now, 103. So I started in 107 in about 99, and it had formerly been a bar, and drop ceilings, a lot of bad carpentry. It was really, I would say the state of the building was condemnable. The roof was bad, the floor was falling in the basement. So I moved in and moved upstairs, put a new roof on it, and just started working from the top down. And it took me about 8 years really to get down to the first floor and get it straightened out and get it, you know, to where it was a viable commercial space again. Really just like kind of like peeling back the onion. Would go in and really just take bad renovations, just old work and old materials, and really just wipe them back and wipe them back. What I've always tried to do is really take the character of the building itself, you know, open up tall ceilings. A lot of what I've done here has been really opening stuff up, because these old buildings with the tall ceilings and the large spaces, it's just something I appeals to me more as an aesthetic. This building we're in now, 103, the owner before me did a lot of like drop ceilings and stuff that it's practical and it's commercial, but I think I've tried to stay more true to the aesthetic and return them to their original state. The coolest thing about 107, when I went and looked at it, it was on the market. A tavern owner, local guy, Lee Shaw, and so he bought this building and this property at 107. It was a bar. It had a liquor license. He bought the bar, took the license, and he didn't want the property. All these properties here was, the people who owned them wanted the stewardship thing. They wanted to make sure whoever it went to was somebody local in the community. This was very important. Lee Shaw actually, he verbalized this specifically, that he wanted to sell it. He didn't have to make a ton of money or anything. He liked me. He liked that I was a local guy, that I was going to do a local thing, that it was going to be part of this community. When you're selling a piece of property, why does that matter? You know, most people that sell property, they don't care who they sell it to. They just want to know that the check's good. This guy wanted to make, like, what is it about the building that made him want to make sure it went to the right person? Why does he care? He didn't even buy it for the building. He bought it for the liquor license. He didn't even care about the building, but for some reason, he wanted to make sure that a local person was going to do a local thing with it. I bought the building, and one of the coolest thing about this building is it has got an elevator, basically a dumbwaiter. It can haul a horse-drawn carriage. So 107 was built, and its original function was handmade harness. H&N Gates, I believe, handmade harnesses. It was the building. And so I imagine they had this dumbwaiter, this elevator in there to bring horse-drawn carriages up and down, because they're basically an upholsterer shop upstairs. They're sewing, making harnesses. I imagine they made a lot of stuff besides just harnesses. But I speculate that then they could bring up their little Maserati buggy or their Ford F-150, like their wagon. You know, they could take this upstairs, they could reupholster the seat, or a nice big Cadillac carriage. You know, they could take it up there and they could work on it and bring it down. Then of course, you know, a lot of freight, you know, being leather products, or if they had sewing equipment and other goods that would be coming and going. And I imagine, I mean, it was a business, probably a large business. They probably had boxes and boxes of finished material going out, finished product going out. So this thing's got this mechanical gear that's like, oh man, the thing must weigh 1,000 pounds. It's got like gear ratio like 50-1, so it's got like 250 cogs that go around and connect with like 50 cogs, and a counterweight. Man, it was framed in. The same thing, man. They had framed in the floor, and then floored over the second floor. This thing goes 3 stories from the first floor to the third floor. The first thing I did when I got there was this thing's like just like doing this, you know, with time. It's just like sagging and falling down, you know. So the first thing I did was I had to go all the way to the basement, and they were like, I'd get all my friends to help me, you know. They were like, "What are you? He's crazy, man. What's he doing?" So they're like, I'm like, man, we gotta support, we gotta jack up the elevator, the gear, you know, we gotta reinforce it. And they're like, well, why are we in the basement? Because we gotta pour a footer, then we had to put a beam, and then we had to go to the first floor, and then we had to put a beam, and then went to the third floor and put a beam. So I reinforced this whole thing. Then I tore out the floor and tore out the ceiling, where it had all been framed in, and just like the roof and the skylight had been framed over and then roofed over. So I tore all that stuff out, peeling back the onion, and then it's like test day, you know, we're like, take the brake off, and this thing, it works, man. It goes down, and I'm like, get the drywall. So we bring like a whole truck full of drywall inside, man, a stack of like 50 sheets of drywall, and throw it on there. I'm like, come on, guys. You know, we're like dragging it upstairs. So the thing's fully functional. And so now we have a woman who's doing refinishing furniture in there, and it's got a little boutique, a design studio. So man, we'll bring in truckfuls of furniture, throw it on that elevator, crank it up to the second floor. It's got a little Santa's little workshop up there. Put the pastels on it and take it back downstairs, and so it's been incredibly useful, you know. And that's one of those deals. It's like the lead and the lead-based paint and the mold and you know, don't talk about this, you know. It's like, man, would OSHA approve that elevator? It's like, it's historic. You know, it's okay. It's grandfathered in. So we use it, man. It's cooler than the other side of the pillow. I kept trying to convince my banker buddies that we're buying all these houses all over the county, all over town. I'm like, man, if we actually bought 40 houses in the West End and renovated them, I mean, we could get the same deals. I mean, they've been really inexpensive. You would change the whole neighborhood. If there were 40 houses got renovated properly, it would change the whole makeup of that neighborhood. And I see it too, you know, when I did my house, I was amazed how just like our block got nicer. Like I said, across the street, that place got redone. Place next door got painted. Some houses get tore down. Some of them are too far gone. And there's a lot of housing stock in Muncie, probably too much, and stuff sitting empty is not good either. But you see this downtown revitalization, and then it's gonna happen. That's gonna take concentric circles and go out and out and out. And it just seems obvious to me that it should go towards campus. No one would have to try to get that to happen. It's gonna happen naturally because of its position. Think about the people that live just north of the arena, the Maplewood and that neighborhood there. You're just as far from the quad as you are from the West End to the quad. You jump on a bike. I've known tons of people that ride their bike to work. Okay, so I talk about professionals, young people, college students. I've known a lot of professors that live in that neighborhood. They can ride their bike to work. People downtown, I mean, you can walk to work, walk to the bank. There's restaurants and bars, the post office. I mean, I love being downtown. I love that I can come down. I always said Muncie was a 15-minute town. You could drive anywhere you wanted to go in 15 minutes, which it's nice living in a smaller city. I moved downtown and it became a 10-minute town. I could get to anywhere in Muncie. I can get out to Walmart. I can go to the south side. I can go out east. I can go out north. I can be there in 10 minutes. A couple of great things that have happened. They renovated Washington Street Bridge, and then they've just completed the Jackson Bridge. It's much more pedestrian friendly, which is extremely important for that neighborhood with college kids, college professors. Young people is really what we need down there, or what would really help change that neighborhood. And I'm talking about young professionals. A mix of student rentals would be good to have a young, vibrant feel. But really, like young people starting out, first homes, it's gonna be some sweat equity. You're younger, you've got some energy for that. Put some style, get your own, your own style and your own imprint on your house. But it's already got a lot of style and character. There's so much, there are 5,000 people, I believe, that commute and come downtown every day to work. So right here's a huge block of housing, very inexpensive. Like I keep talking about the bones, they've got good bones. There's something there to work with. It's really cool to me being in a town with a very strong architecture program. And I'm in all kinds of houses every day. and I see good architecture and I see bad architecture, and that's not my field of study, but I see it and I look at it and I recognize it. These houses, these buildings, they were well designed, and you know it when you're in it. And when you live there or you work there and you interact in that space, you know why it's as wide as it is, and you know why it's as tall as it is. Again, that's just retaining and the quality that's already there. You know, I didn't make up the tall ceilings. It was already there.
For the last few years, the entire country's been going through this foreclosure crisis that's really just turned the whole real estate world upside down. There have been just huge problems with the banks. It has to do with banks selling and bundling mortgages and selling them to other investors. We've had huge numbers of foreclosed homes nationwide. Inevitably, a chunk of those end up in our historic districts. And for a lot of our historic houses, if it's got a leaky roof or some sort of a problem, it's going to deteriorate before we get through that process. One of the great difficulties has even been finding the right person at the bank to talk to even begin to unravel the situation. And it's been a great challenge, and it's a great disadvantage for preservation.
Most people don't have the money to go into one of these houses and spend that kind of money to rehab it. So it's going to be a slow process. It's going to be a really slow process. It's going to take a lot of people who have a lot of heart, who are really invested in Muncie and in the neighborhood, and want to stay. Because if you're 23 years old and you graduate from Ball State, you get a job in Muncie, you buy one of these houses, you have to be committed to spending the next 15 to 20 years of your life living in it, fixing it up, and really building a neighborhood around that house. It's definitely possible, and I see it happening in pieces and pockets, and I've met a lot of really great people who are energized and committed to doing that work. But it's just going to take more. It's going to take more people, it's going to take more money, it's going to take more time.
There are cities in the United States that are completely abandoning whole neighborhoods. Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Ohio, because they've lost so much of their population. Right sizing is a term that's been coined for the shrinking city. Muncie suffered from some of the same events and so forth that have plagued those bigger cities, but I don't see us doing right sizing in that way. I think we can make our downtown neighborhoods viable again.
In dealing with unsafe buildings, it's easy to get caught up in the negative because you're constantly driving around and that's what you're looking for. But then you're also working to help eradicate that. So you're working to tear down those really bad properties, to improve the neighborhood. So when you go back a year later and you see a lot that is clean and it's been taken over by the neighbors and they have a beautiful urban garden there, you see those things and they're like little beacons of light.
The hospital was one of those buildings on the endangered list. There's 11 endangered architectures. That was one of them. And it had sit empty, I don't know for how many years. And it already went through a board up project years ago. And some of those had come down. So last winter, the association working with community development here in Muncie, we boarded up 6 homes. And that was one of them that we finished boarding up in hopes that the weather wouldn't get in it, vagrants wouldn't get in it. But yet it still burnt down. And that's just a tragedy. Because really, people see that as a problem. They see this delinquent building, this dilapidated building, they see it as a problem. And I see it as an opportunity for redevelopment, especially historic preservation. You have one of Muncie's first hospitals. So when you lose that building, you lose obviously its architectural history, but you lose the connection to that period and those people and those events. And that's what I think really makes it sad. And there are people, we talked about demolition, We talked about the city wanted to do demolition, and they wanted to do demolition as part of preservation. There were voices that said tearing down this house preserves the house next to it. But right there, we had houses on each side. One of them might have been demolished, the other one might have been deconstructed, but both of them were gone. And that house still didn't have the interest needed to save it, and it still ended up the victim of a fire. So part of that is an opportunity to say, look, we have this list. This is a great resource to prioritize development if you're going to use historic preservation as one of your models. The other thing is, it's an opportunity to say, how can we get a redevelopment corp started that will start shopping these properties, shopping these opportunities around, and getting people interested in the areas we need them to be interested in. Because downtown success, they want to revitalize downtown, and part of that success is going to be these neighborhoods. And vice versa, this neighborhood success is in part going to be successful from redevelopment in downtown. They're not isolated in these bubbles where one doesn't affect the other. It's got to be a relationship, and it is a relationship.
It's always a struggle. When we do take them down, they're gone forever, and we hate doing that, but many of them are so far gone that it's just such a long shot attracting someone to fix them back up. The dilapidated houses have a bad effect on the rest of the neighborhood. If the house next door to you is vacant and full of rodents, you're probably less inclined to invest in keeping your own house up, and you may actually decide you need to move. And so there where you had one abandoned house, now you have two. It's a really tough call, and timing is everything.
I'm gonna go away from this place, and it's gonna keep living. It's gonna see refresh and rock and roll bands. It saw handmade harnesses and bars, and it's really got this life that's so much bigger than my own. And you start to feel like, I mean, it's just really, it's stewardship. I'm just taking care of it, and it's just sort of my time to take care of it.